My name is Dr. John Bowers, and I'm here as the president of Alpha Omega Alpha, which is the National Honor Medical Society. Through the generosity of Professor David Siegel and his wife, Professor Beatrice Siegel, Alpha Omega Alpha, the National Library of Medicine, and the National Medical Audiovisual Center are preparing a series of films on the lives, the philosophy, and the outstanding scientific contributions of some of our most distinguished medical scientists. These films will be made available to medical schools and other teaching institutions, not only to support the educational program, but hopefully to inspire future doctors. Our distinguished medical scientist and statesman today is Dr. W. Barry Wood, Jr., who is Professor of Microbiology at Hopkins. Dr. Wood is a graduate of the Harvard College, where he was not only a distinguished student with the Phi Beta Kappa key, but as well an outstanding athlete. He then studied medicine at Hopkins, and after 6 years went to Washington University in St. Louis as chairman of the Department of Medicine. To this department, he attracted a number of bright young men who later went on to themselves to distinguished academic careers. One of these bright young men is with us today as Dr. Robert J. Glaser, who himself has had a distinguished career in academic medicine. He too is a graduate of Harvard College, but remained in Boston to study medicine, and then went to Washington University, where he worked with Dr. Wood for about 10 years. So it's only proper that we have Dr. Glaser, as Dr. Wood's former pupil, here on the program to talk with him. Dr. Glaser is currently the Vice President for the Commonwealth Fund in New York, through which he maintains his deep interest in academic medicine.
All right, let's start at the beginning. When did you first think about medicine as a career?
Well, Bob, I really didn't have any idea that I would go into medicine when I was in high school. But I had a surprise my senior year. I took the first science course that I'd taken in high school, and much to my surprise, I won a science prize as a result of taking this course. That made me think that maybe I could do something in science and would be interested in it. So when I went to Harvard as an undergraduate, I decided to concentrate in biochemistry.
Well, you went to Harvard at a time when Mr. Conan, who later, of course, became president, was a distinguished leader in the field of chemistry. Did you have any contact with him as an undergraduate or with other people of that?
Well, I did. As a matter of fact, I can still remember vividly coming out of the chemistry library in the old Converse laboratories at Harvard, walking down the hall one day, and Mr. Conant met me and asked me what I was doing in the biochemistry field, whether I was having a good time. and whether I planned to write an honors thesis. And I told him I really hadn't made any plans, but it was so typical of Mr. Conant. He was then chairman of the department, and I was just an undergraduate student in the chemistry department, but he still knew that I was there and trying to concentrate in this field. So he said, I think I know just where you ought to work to do your honors thesis with Professor L.J. Henderson. Well, I had read Henderson's Fitness of the Environment, which is a book that anyone concentrating in biochemistry would read, and I'd also read his monograph on the blood, which was his great work as a scientist. And the idea of working with L.J. Henderson, it just seemed just too good to be true. And as a result of Mr. Conant's efforts, I was introduced to L.J. and went to work with him in the fatigue laboratory, which was located in the basement of the Harvard Business School across the river. And I used to go over there each day when I had free time in the curriculum and work in his laboratory.
Well, that was really quite a remarkable organization, and of course Henderson was a great figure in American science. But you say you went over there every day. I think that that's sort of interesting to me, because I happen to know, of course, that you also, in addition to your scholastic obligations, were involved in all the major sports. And how did you get time to do all that?
Well, I suppose I was a very compulsive square. I think that's probably the best way to put it. I had my day fairly well planned, and I didn't do very much in college except play on teams, which I enjoyed very much.
Win 10 major letters.
And study. And I really concentrated on these two things. But I did get enough time to go over to Henderson's laboratory, and it was terribly interesting to watch him operate. He was not a laboratory scientist. As a matter of fact, he used to tell me that he was no good in the lab. He broke all the test tubes. He stayed up in a room above the laboratory with his slide rule, and he took the data from the laboratory below. And you remember the laboratory was run by Bruce Dill, whom you know. And the data that would come out of that laboratory, LJ would work on with his slide rule and put it on a nomogram and put it together and write it up. So that he really was a theoretical biologist. He was one of the first theoretical biologists who didn't do a lick of work with his own hands. And later he became a philosopher. Right. He became interested in Pareto. And I think of all the people on the Harvard faculty at that particular time, he had more influence on President Lowell than anyone else. Lowell went to him, consulted him about every major decision. And he was really a tower of strength in that faculty. And to be allowed to work in his laboratory was a tremendous privilege. The one thing that I can remember most clearly, Bob, about this experience was I had to write this honors thesis. And I worked very hard at it. And I tried to perfect every sentence. And when I got through, I said, boy, I've got just a masterpiece to give to LJ to read as my honors thesis. Well, I was called back. He called me back about 3 days after I had given him this thing. And it was sitting on his desk. And it was just covered with red crayon corrections, right from starting with the title. And he began by saying, you know, that title doesn't say what's in the paper. When you give the title to a paper, it should tell the reader what's in the paper. And he began, and he must have spent, Bob, I don't know, 5 hours correcting this, every single word. Gave it back to me, and of course my first reaction was I was mad. I didn't like how he'd torn up all this. Right. But it was a wonderful lesson to me in writing, and I went back and did the whole thing over again, taking into consideration all of his corrections, And then, of course, he liked it a little better. Now, that had a lasting impression on me because I have always tried to do that with my own students later on. It seems to me that's one of the functions of a departmental chairman or a senior faculty member, to try to help junior faculty people and students to write scientific papers properly.
I can't help but smiling because I remember, as you may, the first time that I completed some work in the laboratory and brought the paper to you again thinking that I had the world's greatest masterpiece and got it back in the same form, and I feel as you do that taught me more about writing than anything in the world. Well, I wanted to ask you, you did this honors thesis, and you actually did an experimental thesis and got, I think that was when you first became interested in the white cell. Would you say a word or two about what that program was and how you managed to carry it out while you were doing all the other things?
Well, I think this was Henderson's idea and Dill's, that since I was an athlete and was involved in fairly strenuous physical exertion from time to time, that it might be fun to see what happened to certain things, blood sugars, other things, when I was involved in a football game or a hockey game. And they had studied in the fatigue laboratory people like Clarence DeMar, the famous marathon runner, who had a resting pulse rate of about 45 and didn't consume any oxygen when he ran on the treadmill. He was such a good runner. And these were the things that they were interested in. So they naturally turned to something of this kind. And we decided to study the leukocyte count, the white blood cell count during strenuous physical exertion. So my primary function was to persuade my colleagues on the football team to allow somebody to take a white count from the ear before the game, and then right after they came out of the game. If it was at the end of the half, we all came out. And in those days, you know, everybody played both ways. You played defense and offense. There wasn't any of this platoon system.
Right.
And so you got a beating, and you came out between the halves, and they'd grab a white count on you. And the rises in leukocyte count were really very impressive. In a good football game, your white count would go from a normal of 5,000 or 6,000 to 25,000, just as though you had acute appendicitis.
Right.
And I became tremendously interested in this phenomenon, and they did this not only with football players, but they did it with hockey players. And I was playing in the hockey team then, and it was fun because you'd go on the ice and tear up and down the ice and get all pooped out and come, and as soon as you'd sit down, this fellow would come and prick your ear and take the white count. And again, the rises were considerable. And I based my thesis on this work, trying to write it up. And this is the paper that Dr. Henderson chewed up for me when I wrote it. Did
you do any comparisons between the rise in white count after the Yale game as with other teams?
Well, all the games, Bob, they were all done, and it had to be done in such a way that it didn't interfere with the players' well-being and psychology. We had to be careful. But I remember trying to persuade some fairly tough characters that it was a good thing to have this ear puncture and have the white count done. And we really had a lot of fun doing it.
Was that your first publication?
That was the first publication, and they decided to publish it in a German physiology journal. And of course, I was tremendously proud of my first publication, and I still have a copy of it tucked away somewhere.
Right. Well, now, that, of course, would have been done in your senior year, and when you finished Harvard, you graduated with a summa cum laude. By that time, you decided to go to medical school, of course, and knowing the way that many people who are at Harvard College feel about the Harvard Medical School, it's always been of some interest to me that you didn't go to Harvard. Could you tell us a little? Obviously, you had your choice of anywhere you wanted to go. What led you not to stay in Boston and to go down to Hopkins particularly?
I'm not sure I should answer that question. I see you're wearing a Harvard tie. That should be very careful what I say.
We won't hold anything against you.
Well, I had a tremendous affection and loyalty for Harvard. It was a magnificent place. It still is, and it was one of the high points in my life to be allowed to go there. My family had gone there for generations, and I had gone to a private school that led into Harvard, and I was in the groove, so to speak.
Right.
But I decided after college that it would be a good thing to get away from Boston. After all, I'd been there all my life, and it seemed to me very wise to get out and to go to another place. And I had just been married, and my wife's father was a physician and had been to Johns Hopkins, and I used to hear him talk about it, what a wonderful place it was. And he was there in the days when Osler and Welch and Kelly, he was Kelly's one of his very first residents on the gynecology service. And then I also looked at the Hopkins catalog and noticed that they had a lot of free time to do special studies and research, and I was interested. By that time, I'd gotten interested in the idea of doing research. So it seemed to me that I ought to go to Johns Hopkins. When I went and talked to some of the Boston Brahmin physicians,
They probably went into shock, didn't they?
and they just told me I was crazy. They said that Johns Hopkins was a second-rate place, that there was no medical school that could measure up with the Harvard Medical School. But despite that advice, I decided to go to Hopkins, and of course I've never regretted it.
Right. Well, when you got down there, in the first place, you were in a rather unusual position, because in those days, of course, not many people were married, so that you had a somewhat different living arrangement than most medical students. How did it go down there? What interested you? What got you started, for example, in one or another area? Were there multiple choices that appealed, as there seemed to be in most people's lives?
Well, first of all, Bob, the living arrangements are interesting. My wife came from Vassar, and I'd come through this Harvard curriculum and background, and there were no living quarters except boarding houses. And I remember we lived in a boarding house. The total expense for the year, including our tuition and running a car, we had an old Ford car, was $1,100 for the two of us.
And Leo was
And
in
she
school.
was going to school at the same time, taking work at Goucher, getting ready to come into the School of Public Health, where she eventually got a doctor's degree in the School of Public Health. And I remember one night we lived, the houses were very close together, and there were a couple of other medical students who lived right across from us, and we could hear them talking sometimes at night. We were in bed one night, and I remember hearing this guy say to his partner, he said, you know, I don't think I'd want to live the way that guy Wood does, married and tied down the way he is. And of course, my wife just thought that was great. But we had a wonderful time going through graduate school together. And when my son, my third son, was married fairly recently, and his wife is a great student. They're both on the faculty at Princeton now. I told them at that time that the greatest privilege they would have would be going through graduate school together. Right. And they did that. They went through the Harvard graduate school together, he in history and his wife in English, and now they're both teaching on the Princeton faculty. And we had that same privilege of studying together, of trying to grow up together, and it was just a wonderful business all around. Now we got interested. Again, it always comes back to people, Bob. It seems to me, if you look back on your life, you see that the things that really influence you are your experiences with specific people, and there are not too many of them that have an influence on, but a few do. And there was a man on the Hopkins faculty named Mansfield Clark, who was the professor of biochemistry and a really great scientist. He had come up as a physical chemist and had come to Hopkins to take over the biochemistry department, and I had the privilege of working in his laboratory. And he was then working on oxidation reduction potentials. He was famous for two things: for his book on pH, which was just a Bible to all biochemists, And then he got interested in oxidation reduction potentials, and I became interested in this and did some work in his laboratory. And then the following summer, Mrs. Wood and I went out to University of Wisconsin and studied in the agricultural school there in the bacteriology department, where they were also interested in oxidation reduction potentials. And the person who led us out there, because she was studying there, was the president of Radcliffe, Polly Bunting. And she was there as a graduate student, and she persuaded us to come out there for the summer. And it was a great experience for us going into a state university. We'd never been in this kind of an institution before. And we just had a wonderful time. We spent most of the time in the incubator room, 37-degree incubator room, in the middle of the summer when it was terribly hot. And I think we had to eat salt tablets 2 or 3 times a day.
I understand you also got a little tennis in on the side, huh?
Yes, we both loved to play tennis, and I can remember we played in a tennis tournament with a temperature of 110 one time there, and it was the hottest I think I've ever been.
Well, at that point in your career, I presume that you thought about staying in basic science and biochemistry, but also at that point you began your clinical studies. Did that, in view of what you ultimately did, would you say a little about why you, what influenced you in respect to clinical medicine and why you finally elected to?
Well, the following summer, after having been at Wisconsin, we went back to Boston, and I took a clerkship at the Boston City Hospital. Now, in those days, Bob, you may remember, Soma Weiss was the head of the service, and Chester Kiefer and Bill Castle were the 2 attending men on the ward that summer when I went on there as a student. And we'd make ward rounds with Kiefer and Castle alternate days. And of course, this was a
very exciting,
very inspiring experience. And I can still remember clearly a case of paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, one of my patients that I was working on. And Castle got excited about this and invited me over to his laboratory to study the blood of this patient, make some special studies on it. And there I became aware of the tremendous fascinations of clinical research. Now, this disgusted Dr. Clark because he wanted me to become a biochemist. And I had to finally make a decision at the end of medical school whether to take an internship in medicine. And Clark was all for my going right into biochemistry. But I had been bitten by the clinical bug, and I decided to take an internship, and I went on, as you know, took it.
What about your clinical experience as a medical student at Hopkins? Did that further substantiate your interest? Was it as much fun as that summer had been in Boston?
Well, it really was. And I suppose the turning point in terms of the field that I eventually got into was when a decision had to be made as to what special field I would be in as an assistant resident. Dr. Longcoat ran the service in such a way that each assistant resident had a specialty. And I wanted to be in the metabolism, biochemistry specialty because of my interest in biochemistry. But there was a man above me on the ladder who'd had more experience than I had in this field, and Dr. Longcoat said he would do that. And then he said, don't you want to perhaps go into the immunochemistry field, which is really quite chemical? And he gave me some papers to read. Bob, he gave me the Rockefeller Institute report, Papers of Avery.
Okay.
And this had a tremendous influence on me. I read these papers. They all had to do with pneumococcus, and I never got over the pneumococcus, as you know. The white cell and the pneumococcus I've just stayed with all the time. And I got excited about these papers, and he even sent me to New York to see Avery. And I can still remember to this day going into Avery's office, and he sat me down at a table, and he paced the floor. He was a little tiny man. He looked like a chipmunk. and he had on his long white coat, and he would pace the floor, and he told me the whole story of the pneumococcus capsule and the polysaccharide in such a way that I was just entranced by it. And I went back with great enthusiasm for getting into this infectious disease field. And I suppose I was also influenced by the fact that as a senior student on the wards, it just happened that I was on OSLA 2, which is was the ward where all the black men were admitted. In those days, they segregated
Right.
patients, which they don't do now. As you know, we've progressed a little bit in regard to that. But they were segregated, and some of the sickest patients would come in there, particularly patients from the Bethlehem Steelworks, where these men would work in front of this hot furnace all day and then go out into the cold, and they'd get pneumococcal pneumonia.
Right.
And I had 11 straight admissions of pneumococcal pneumonia. Well, I had such an exposure to the disease that I obviously got excited in it. So that the combination of seeing all those patients and Dr. Longcope steering me to Dr. Avery led into my work in the pneumococcal.
Well, now, as a house officer, as an assistant resident, did you get any time to do any research?
A little bit, Bob, but not very much. I was able to work a little more than most people in the bacteriology lab because I was interested in it. And I did a little bit of work with Dr. Perrin Long, who was then head of the infectious disease group. Tillett, who later became head of medicine at NYU, was there for one of my years, and I had the chance to get to know him. And he also had an influence on me because I noticed as I would walk by his door, I may have told you this story before, but I'd walk by his door many times a day going up to the bacteriology lab, and I would always see him in the same pose. He was never working at the lab, at the bench. He was always walking up and down in his laboratory just thinking. And this made an impression on me, and he once told me the story of one of the persons at the Rockefeller Institute who made some great contributions in pneumococcus, who really never did anything in the lab. In fact, they got disenchanted with him because when they wanted to find him, they'd find him up in his room lying on his bed. And he didn't do anything until several months later when he came down into the laboratory and did the definitive experiment to work out the typing of pneumococcus, which became, as you know, one of the most important things in therapy. And Tillett used to say to me that it's not the time that you spend with your hands in doing experiments that are important, it's the time that you spend thinking about what you're going to do.
Right.
And I've seen so many people come barging into the laboratory and want to do something right off without thinking what they're doing. And Tillett was a great example of a person who thought about this.
Well, now, after you had 2 years as an assistant resident, I know you got a National Research Council fellowship and went back to Harvard to work. And that period, of course, was a terribly interesting one because the sulfonamides had come along and that really revolutionized the treatment of infectious diseases and certainly of pneumococcal disease. Could you say something about how you decided you furthered your, of course, the interest you've had all these years in the leukocyte, but how did you happen to get onto the problem that you dealt with? How did you develop that method of producing pneumonia in rats and so forth?
Well, first of all, Bob, I had a terrible time deciding whether to go and work with Hastings in the biochemistry department or go to Zintz's department in bacteriology, because I still had this background in biochemistry that influenced me a great deal. And of course, Clark was pushing me all the time to go to Hastings. And I went to see them both. And I finally decided to go to Zintz's department. And Zintzer was a great character, as you no doubt know. He was, at that time, dying of leukemia. And he used to come into my laboratory and show me the petechiae on his hands and arms. And he said, you know, the only thing that really bothers me is that I can't ride to the hounds. He was a great rider. And the reason he couldn't ride to the hounds was his spleen was so big. And this bothered him a great deal. But the one thing that saved him during this final year of his life, and he died the summer that I finished in the laboratory, The one thing that saved him, Bob, was his work. And he used to come in and say to me, if I didn't have my work to come to every day, this would be awful. And you probably know, you remember the way he wrote this up in his autobiography?
Right.
I think that account of how he felt when the doctor told him he had a fatal disease is one of the most beautiful
Yes,
expositions of what a dying patient feels like. And I've, as you know, given that to house officers to read, because it seems to me if you can appreciate what the patient really thinks about, you can handle the patient so much better. And Zinsser was magnificent about this, and he finally died that summer. But he allowed me to work with John Enders. Now, John Enders at that time was not a virologist. He got his start on the pneumococcus. And so he was the logical person with whom I should work. And he took a great interest in my problem. And I had, as I said, I'd gotten bitten by the leukocyte and the pneumococcus. And I wanted to try to set up a model that you could study the disease in a small animal and find out more about how the disease really works. And I suppose that that's been my primary interest in medical research really all my life. Mechanisms of disease, or what we call in the trade pathogenesis. And I've never gotten over this. I've always wanted to know why certain things happen in patients. The rationale being that if you know what's really going on, maybe you can do something for the patient and your therapy will be rational. Well, John Enders helped me a great deal to get started, and it was just at that time that he was turning to virology. And I can remember him showing me some of the earliest tissue culture tubes that he used. And he later, as you know, went on to win the Nobel Prize for his poliovirus work, and I suppose is our most distinguished virologist today. Right. But he was a joy to work with. And you probably know that he got into science very late. He was an English major. He was working with Kittredge to get his PhD at Harvard. And he roomed with an Australian microbiologist who used to take him over to the laboratory every once in a while to let him look through the microscope. And he got excited about what he saw. And just before he wrote his thesis for Kittredge, he decided to shift. And he came over to Zinsser. And you know, Zinsser was interested in literature. He was a poet. He wrote many things. And when Enders came over to him, an English major, and said, "Can I come and work in your laboratory?" So Zinsser said, "Certainly." And Enders had to go and take all the chemistry courses and do all the preliminary work. And he later came over and got his PhD with Zinsser, and then went on to be, as I said, one of our most distinguished scientists. But I can remember Mrs. Wood and I went out to his house one night for dinner, Bob, and he read Paradise Lost aloud to us. It was an experience that I'll just never forget. He was just most extraordinary man, a real scholar, both a literary scholar and a scientist.
Right. Well, now this model that you developed in the rat, and of course I remember it very well from later years when we were doing the streptococcus. I wish we had a chance to have a little picture of all those rats dancing on the end of the apparatus when they were anesthetized. But how long did it take to develop that technique? I used to say that you were the founder of the American Board of Rat Bronchoscopy because that was the way you got the infection going. But
that's really not true, Bob. The method had been worked out to some extent by a man named Nungester at Michigan. And they had published a couple of papers. And what I really did was take their method and modify it to my particular needs. And then, as you know, we used it for all sorts of things, including your very nice studies on the hemolytic streptococcus. And it turned out to be a very convenient model. You could produce a disease in the rat that looked almost exactly like the human disease. And of course, you had the advantage with the rat of being able to sacrifice the animal at the appropriate time, and then looking to see what was happening. And this is precisely what I wanted to do. I first became interested in how antiserum works. And you don't remember this because it was before your day as a house officer, but at that time, when I was going through the house staff, we had to treat patients with antiserum. Right. This was the standard therapy. This was before the antibiotics and before sulfonamide came in. And nobody knew how the antiserum worked. Well, with the model, we were able to produce the disease in the animal, treat them with antiserum, and then look and see what happened. And in this way, it was possible to get a fairly clear picture right. of how the antibody worked. And then we went on and did the same thing with sulfonamide drugs that came in at that time, and later on did the same thing with penicillin. And the model has been very useful to study the mechanism of recovery in this disease, which is still, a very right. important disease.
Well, of course, one of the very important aspects of that work was your demonstration of the role of the leukocyte, and in many ways, you focused on the host defense mechanism long before it became popular. In recent years, in a sense, it's become much more of an important subject, even though we have many more drugs that are effective. And I think those studies were terribly important from that point of view. You spent, what, 1 year in Boston?
Right.
And then you went back to Hopkins in the Department of Medicine.
Right.
And you were there, of course, that was the period when the war was on, and I think you got involved in you got involved in the atypical pneumonia commission. That led you sort of into a little different area in the sense that you were dealing with non-bacterial disease.
Well, they were having trouble in the recruits, particularly, Bob, with a disease known then as primary atypical pneumonia, which meant that we didn't understand the etiology of it. And it was causing epidemics in the army camps, particularly in the South, in Louisiana. So we were sent down to Camp Claiborne, which is right in the middle of Louisiana, as a commission from the Armed Forces Epidemiological Board. The head of that board was Francis Blake, who at that time was chairman of the Department of Medicine at Yale. And he had interviewed me as a National Research Council right. fellow candidate before I went to Boston, and so I knew him. And he asked me to be on this commission and then sent me down with a group. John Dingle was the head of the group, to study this disease. And we did everything we could to try to determine the etiology, and we were unsuccessful. It's now known that the organism we were dealing with was a mycoplasma, right. an atypical right. bacterium, which we couldn't grow because we didn't know how to do it in those days. And the disease has been very well worked out now, but at that time it really wasn't known what the etiologic agent was. All we knew was that it caused great trouble. People were very sick. I got the disease about 3 weeks after I got down there, and the terrible thing about that, Bob, was that the Sugar Bowl game was being played in New Orleans, and my wife was going to fly down to, I guess she's really coming on a train in those days. I must remember that, but we didn't have planes then. But she was coming down a train from Baltimore to go to the Sugar Bowl game with me. And 2 days before the Sugar Bowl game, I came down with a disease. And I had a temperature of about 104, but I had a very understanding physician, a great friend of mine named Matthews, and he said, well, it won't do you any harm to go to the Sugar Bowl game. So I remember we went to the Sugar Bowl game, and Fordham was playing. Vince Lombardi was playing.
Right.
He was one of the 7
blocks of
granite.
Right.
And we sat in the rain watching this game, the Sugar Bowl game, and then I went right back to bed when we got home and got over the disease in 5 or 6 days. But it made you feel badly for several weeks. And it was a very disabling disease for the military. The number of man days lost in the Army camps was considerable, so it was an important military.
Of course, that whole period was a very interesting one in the infectious disease area. The streptococcal studies that Ramel Camp and others did brought all sorts of new dimensions. Well, you got invited to St. Louis very soon after you had gone back to Baltimore. You'd only been in Baltimore 2 years, and obviously the invitation must have come before the end of the 2 years. Tell us a little about that, because you were not quite 32, and that's a fairly unusual age even now for people to take over a department.
Well, I received a telephone call, Bob, when I was down there from the dean of Washington University, Philip Schaefer. And he came right to the point over the phone and said that the faculty had decided to invite me to come there as the professor of medicine. Well, I was just flabbergasted. I had just finished my house officer training. I'd been out only 2 years from my assistant residency. But I did know that medical school was famous for taking young people as heads of departments. They took Dr. Willard Allen as professor of obstetrics and gynecology, was, I think, 32 when he was made professor. Dr. Everett Graham, when he was made professor of surgery, was very young. And so they had a tradition of taking younger people to head the departments. But I went back to Baltimore and talked to some of my colleagues about it, and I got the same reaction from everybody, Bob, that I was too young to take it, that I would be bogged down by administrative duties, and my chance to go on with research would be destroyed, and that I just shouldn't take it. It was very flattering, but don't take it. Well, I thought it over very carefully and talked to my wife about it a great deal, and we finally decided to go. And we were taking a chance, but I obviously don't regret it because things worked out very well, and it was a great privilege to be trying to run and build a department at that age when you're fairly vigorous and you're not bound down with lots of tradition. And of course, it was tremendously exciting.
Well, I'd like to focus on that a minute because you went there in 1942, and by today's standards, of course, medical schools in general and departments were small. The war was on, but ended not too long after that. And I think it'd be interesting if you'd say a bit about what it was like in the first place, going in as a very young man. That faculty was distinguished. There were some fairly senior citizens around. And perhaps say something about how you went about building the department. Obviously, I was there much of that time, but I think it would be very interesting to hear you say something.
Well, needless to say, Bob, I was petrified. I had seen distinguished professors of medicine operate, and I thought that I wasn't prepared to do this, but I was going to have to learn. And I think the only really smart thing I did in the whole operation was to enter into it very gradually. And fortunately, I had the help of a wonderful man, Dr. Harry Alexander, who was the acting head of the department. When Dr. Barr left to go to Cornell, Dr. Alexander, who was a distinguished allergist and a wonderful internist, had been made the acting head. He was in private practice, so-called part-time, and wasn't being considered as the full-time chief, although he could have done a wonderful job with it. But when I went, I asked Dr. Alexander if he would be willing to let me be an observer for the first 2 or 3 months and not do anything except go around with him on ward rounds and get to know the people in the department and make no decisions of any kind, just try to learn the place as much as I could about the place. And I remember going on ward rounds with him, and I'd go on ward rounds and wouldn't say a word. I would just go with him, with the house staff, and see how he operated. And I got a feel for the place. And of course, my first reaction always was, well, this is different from Hopkins, and for example, they let the students go into the outpatient in the senior year. Half time on the wards, half time on the outpatient. I said, that's a crazy system. You know, at Hopkins, we went in the junior year, but one of the things that my good wife taught me right from the very beginning, she said, just never mention Johns Hopkins. And of course, I was very careful about it. I never mentioned this is the way we do it at Hopkins, you know, which just would turn everybody off. And I really, after looking at this, saw why they put the students in the outpatient the senior year. There was a good reason for it, and I never changed it. If I had jumped in fast and tried to make changes quickly, I could have gotten all tangled up. And the other thing I had, which you know all about because you were one of them, I had the most extraordinary group of senior residents, chief residents. And my motto was that the resident was always right. And I really stuck to that because he was always right. He knew so much more about what was going on than the professor or any attending man could. So I paid a great deal of attention to what the resident said about things, and he guided me through these difficult situations that I would have, bunged up and messed up if I hadn't had the help. And I, as you know, met every morning with the chief resident, and he would tell me about all the cases that came in during the night, tell me exactly what the problems were, and also about any problems on the ward, who died. All this information I got on a man-to-man basis, very personal with the resident. And we would run into a problem that we didn't understand, either of us, very well, and we'd just walk around the corner to the library and look up the answer. And this was a great educational experience for me, and I think it was helpful to the residents.
I was going to say, you're rather generous about what the residents contributed, but I really do think it was one of the most exciting and stimulating experiences anyone could have. And I think that, looking back on it, and I'd be interested to have your comments, in those days when house staffs were relatively small and people who were serving as department chairman by and large stayed around most of the time, there was a marvelous interchange. You remember we had rounds 3 or 4 times a week, and we really saw one another an awful lot. Lots of that's been lost, I think, don't you?
Well, Bob, I think that's a sign of our age, but bigness gets us into awful troubles. I think some of our worst difficulties in universities today are due to tremendous expansion. And the problem of maintaining quality that can be maintained only on a very personal basis becomes compounded when you get into the multiversity situation that we all know about through Clark Kerr's book. We are suffering from it now in the Johns Hopkins Medical School. You were suffering from it at Stanford. Now, in Washington University at that time, we really were not suffering from it. We were small enough so that with 5 or 6 assistant residents, a senior resident, and 10 interns, working very intimately with the staff, it was possible for us to interact in a very personal way. And the way you behaved as a resident, for example, you felt perfectly free to call me up in the middle of the night about any difficult problem on the ward. In fact, I urged you to do that. It got me involved. Right. I learned a tremendous amount from it. And it meant that we were working very closely together as a team. When you get things bigger, it's very difficult to do this. And I think one of the joys of the situation that we encountered there was the very intimate relationship that we had between house staff and faculty attendings. And when I went later on to an administrative job at Hopkins, and then later came into microbiology department, the one thing I've missed more than anything is not the contact with the students. I still have that in microbiology. But it was that very special relationship with house staff. Right. And it just had made a tremendous impression on me. And I think that some of my very closest friends were former house officers.
Well, again, I can speak from experience. It was a marvelous opportunity for people at that stage of the game who were pursuing clinical medicine. And I think that, as you know, one of the satisfactions all of us got was your enthusiasm and interest and your ability to do stimulating teaching on almost every problem. Now, at the same time, you still managed to carry your investigative program forward in a very effective way. How did you plan that ahead of time? It wasn't easy, I know, and yet obviously you did it.
Well, Bob, I had the idea, which I still believe is valid, that to be a stimulating teacher in any field, one has to be doing some kind of research. I think if you just teach and are not doing any kind of creative work at the at the cutting face of the subject in which you're working, you can't be an inspiring teacher. And so I felt it was part of my duty as a teacher to be engaged in research. It wasn't something that I found difficult to do because I loved it. And I suppose this is a certain amount of rationalization is involved in this, but I really do think that the great teachers are the ones who are involved in research, but at the same time are sufficiently involved in clinical medicine to be good clinicians. And this is one of the dilemmas that the modern doctor is in an academic setting. How can you be good in research, particularly today when it's so complicated, and at the same time be a good clinician? Well, you try to do it, and I tried to do it. And I was able to do something in this regard because I had working with me Carl Moore, who is now the head of the department at Washington University, and we worked out an arrangement where we shared the chairmanship. He was co-chairman, and he took the service half the year, and I took it half the year. And the half year that I was on service, I was a clinician. I was just devoting all my efforts to patients and to the students on the wards, but the other half year I could go into the laboratory and work. He could do the same. And this was a wonderful arrangement for us both. Now, you had to have somebody, Bob, as you know, that you had absolute faith in, complete confidence.
Right.
And Carl was an associate professor when I came there. And within 2 years, I was able to get the faculty to promote him to a full professor because I quickly became aware of this extraordinary man who was,
Right.
you know, now today I think I would rank him among the top 2 or 3 professors of medicine in the world. And here he was, a colleague of mine. I had a chance to share this with him. So this was a very special circumstance, and it made it possible for both of us to work roughly half-time at research and the other half-time in teaching.
Well, I think it really was a superb system, but it did depend, as you suggest, on the fact that the two of you had such marvelous rapport and so much mutual respect. It was during that period, of course, that you continued your studies of infections, but you got quite interested in the business of fever and why fever was an accompaniment of bacterial infections. Would you say a word or two about how that interest really came about, other than the fact that fever was obviously concomitant of infection, and what led you to move more directly into the study of fever?
Well, Bob, I can remember when we got started on that. I had been concentrating on the pneumococcus. And I'm sure I've told you the story of Dr. Avery. When I went to visit him that time, as I mentioned earlier, in his laboratory, he told me that there were 2 kinds of investigators. He said there are investigators in biological science or science in general who go around picking up the surface nuggets. And wherever they can spot a surface nugget of gold, they'll go try to grab it and put it in their collection. And he said, then there's another kind of investigator who's not really interested in the surface nuggets. He's much more interested in digging a deep hole in one place, hoping to hit a vein. And of course, if he strikes a vein of gold, why he, is tremendous advantage. Well, now Avery was such a wonderful example of that.
Right.
He was what Colin MacLeod used to call an obligate pneumococcologist. He was only interested in the pneumococcus. And if you look at his bibliography, there's one paper out of, can't remember how many, on the streptococcus, which you remember is a cousin of the pneumococcus. Right. Everything else has to do with pneumococcus. And yet, Dr. Avery is the father of modern molecular genetics.
Yes, he is.
All this exciting field that we're now in was brought out by Avery's extraordinary discovery that the molecule important in heredity is DNA.
Right.
And Avery was responsible for this, studying his dear old pneumococcus, which he stayed with all of his life.
Right.
But having been impressed by Avery's doctrine and his own career, I was very hesitant to leave the pneumococcus at all. But I rationalized again and said, well, I'm just as much interested in that leukocyte that I started working with in college, and I really did have this double interest.
Right.
Because the leukocyte, after all, is the thing that chews up the pneumococcus and makes the patient recover. And I was really studying leukocytes as much as pneumococcus. And one of the extraordinary things that happens to you when you get sick with an infectious disease, or many diseases, is that you develop fever. And one of the things that impressed me most as a clinician was how little we knew about fever. Here was something that we all relied on. We've taken temperatures of patients, for decades, and we chart the temperature in the hospital, and we pay attention to whether the temperature goes up or down, and yet we had no notion as to why it goes up and down. Well, this fascinated me, and I was fortunate at that time to have a very bright house officer who later became a fellow and worked with me, named Elisha Atkins, who's now a professor of medicine at Yale. And he came into the laboratory to work with me, and we started working on the problem of fever. And he since has gone on and is probably better known than almost anybody in the world today for the work on the pathogenesis of fever. And I had the privilege of working with him in those very early years. And we quickly found that the cell that was making this pyrogen, which is the hormone, really, that acts up here on the hypothalamus and resets the thermostat so your temperature goes up, came from our friend the leukocyte.
Right.
So it was a very logical progression to get into this, and as you know, I've been involved in this ever since, trying to isolate this leukocyte hormone that acts on the hypothalamus, and working very closely with Dr. Atkins. We keep in touch on these things, and it's continued to be a very exciting problem.
Well, in that connection, I know, of course, how deeply interested you were in this field, and I know also, as we've already talked about, the problems of trying to run a clinical department and do research at the same time. Was the decision to return to Hopkins at all key to the fact that you thought you might be able to get more research done? What led you to make this move? After all, you had a great department, and things were going superbly well. How did you decide to accept the invitation to come back to Hopkins?
I think I'd have a hard time answering that very convincingly, Bob. It seems to me decisions of that kind, as you know, you've been through them yourself, they're not made up here by logic. They're made down here in the middle of your solar plexus. I just had a feeling at that time that I might be able to contribute something if I went back to Hopkins and took on this job of trying to coordinate the medical school, the School of Public Health, and the hospital. I'd been in St. Louis for 13 years. I knew that Carl Moore was right there and would take over. I didn't have any worries about leaving the ship when it wasn't in good shape. And as that's turned out to be correct, because as you know, that department has just flourished under Carl Moore's direction. But I had a feeling that perhaps I could contribute something. And Dr. Lowell Reed, who had been the vice president in this slot that he wanted me to come into, and was then acting president of Hopkins, persuaded me very convincingly that I could make a contribution. Some of the key members of the faculty wanted me to come, so I decided to go.
They did set it up, though, so that you were going to be in microbiology as well as in an administrative job.
I had reservations about whether I could be effective in administration, whether I'd be happy in it. So I left myself an escape hatch. The trustees very kindly permitted me to keep a laboratory in the microbiology department, continue to do some research. And I tried to do my administrative work in the morning and get to the lab in the afternoon. Now, as you know, Bob, you can divide your life that way to some extent. But when you're doing research, it's not what you think about when you're in the laboratory that's important. It's what you think about after dinner, in the morning when you shave. You've got to have your mind on these research problems. Now, if you've got your mind on administrative problems, and they have to do with other people, the welfare of other people, that's what an administrator is. He's trying to do things so that other people can operate properly. It seems to me it's one of the most unselfish occupations there is, actually, to be a good administrator. You'd have all those problems on your mind. So what I found happened to me was that in all these hours outside the working day, I was thinking about the administrative problems. And I found this difficult to carry this water on both shoulders this way. And after 4 years of it, when other circumstances made it permissible for me to get back into full-time teaching and research, why
And that's
jumped at the opportunity.
That's what you did, and that's when you took over the department, and since that time have devoted yourself to a basic science. Well, it's a fascinating career, and I think the most impressive part of it all is that over the years it's been a career in which contributions to students and science and universities have all been very impressive indeed, and I'm sure that this will all continue in the time ahead.
Well, Bob, the only thing I'd like to say about it in the end is that it's all been wonderful fun. I just wouldn't change one thing about it. It's just been tremendous privilege and fun. And I just hope that in the new generation, where things are going to be a little more complicated, that it will be possible for people to have as much fun doing this as you and I had at Washington University and later on.